Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. A few days ago, I was asked in a talk about a piece I wrote in the Jerusalem Post back in October 2022, just before the last election, in which I warned that Itamar Ben-Gvir joining a government could be damaging for Israel. I was asked how I thought things were playing out. Well, I said to the person who asked, "How does it look to you?" Israel has been on a roller coaster ever since. There was the judicial reform, the division in Israeli society like never before, and now we find ourselves 9 months into a war without a clear plan for how this ends. Like many countries in the world, one of the causes here has been the wave of populism that has overtaken Israel. And the question is whether centrism is the answer. That is what we will tackle today in a conversation with Yair Zivan, the foreign policy advisor to Israel's leader of the opposition, Yair Lapid, and the editor of the new book, The Center Must Hold: Why Centrism is the Answer to Extremism and Polarization. I talked to Yair Zivan about his new book, what he is trying to achieve with its publication, why centrism is the right path forward, as well as what a government that would not include Netanyahu or Ben-Gvir, one that his leader, Yair Lapid, is trying to form, what it would do differently. I then speak with two JPPI senior fellows, Avi Gil and Shmuel Rosner, to get their take on the political situation and where things are going. Let's begin. Yair Zivan, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here. It's good to see you.
So we're talking because, I actually think you'd be interesting to talk to, regardless of this book. I think you've been doing some interesting work over the last decade plus minus, but we are here on the occasion of the publication of your book, The Center Must Hold: Why Centrism is the Answer to Extremism and Polarization, which is a wordy way of saying don't be a populist extremist, be a middle of the road guy. So explain to us for a moment, and then we're going to talk a bit about current affairs, politics, where you see everything going, because you do have a day job that I want to tap into a bit. But talk to me about the book. Why did you feel compelled to put this together? And what is the objective? I mean, this is a book that I feel, looking at and skimming, is mission driven, right?
Yeah, so this is not an academic book. This is not an objective analysis of the pros and cons. The book is a call to arms. Glibly in the conclusion, I write, "Centrists of the world unite." The idea is to say, in this current political moment, in this climate where extremism and polarization and populism are the most dangerous trends that we are facing in democratic societies, there needs to be a political fight back that is coherent, that's compelling, that's consistent, I think, and that can really win that argument back. So I'll go back to your introduction on just one small thing. I don't think it is about being middle of the road. I actually think it's about being passionate and strong about an alternative approach to how politics works. The idea that centrism is the same as the middle, I think, is one of the biggest preconceptions, and it's wrong. Centrism is not about cutting the difference between left and right. It's not about being dragged around depending on where the extremes are. It's about saying there is a set of values, a coherent set of principles that we believe in, that are the center of how liberal democracy should function. Now everybody else is going to have to arrange themselves according to where we are and not the other way around. So that's what the book is trying to do. And it essentially makes two parallel arguments that run together and have to run together. The first one is that there is such a thing as political centrism, right? That you can identify it, you can understand it, you can categorize it, you can see who is and isn't a centrist, you can see what values they subscribe to, and we can talk about those a little bit more as we go on. And the second is that in the face of extremism, in the face of polarization, in the face of populism, the answer to the extreme populist right can't come from the extreme populist left. The answer to the illiberal left can't come from the illiberal right. The answer to those things can only come from the center. That is the place where the solutions come to, and where the fight back, where the antidote is to those trends. So those are the two arguments through the book, and it's based around a series of essays written by kind of centrist leaders from all over the world: North America, Latin America, Africa, Asia, Europe, and of course Israel as well, who lay out, I think, a pretty compelling vision for what political centrism can be, what it is, and how it should approach most of the biggest challenges we face today.
So, I mean, just for our viewers and listeners to know, there are contributions in this book from Tony Blair, Michael Bloomberg, Malcolm Turnbull from Australia, Catherine Murdoch, the daughter-in-law of, and a bunch of other people. But I'm curious, you know, you and I feel like we've had this conversation over a number of years, especially in the Israeli context of how, and I think you're seeing this now actually playing out globally, and especially in Europe, right, where we're seeing the elections to the European Parliament, the rise of the far right in places like France, and the election results now in Spain and Belgium. In the UK, where you come from, is Nigel Farage's Reform Party is now poised potentially to become the second party after Labour, depending what happens to the Tories and the Conservatives. I saw a poll yesterday, showed Conservatives at 20%, Reform at 16%, but whatever, put that aside.
Not how the British political system works. No, he won't. Reform Party might get one seat. It's actually, the UK is a good example, because according to every poll that we've seen, that the Labour Party, which has dragged itself back to the political centre, is set for an enormous election victory. And that's actually a good lesson that we can look at.
The Labour Party, you're saying that's a good, okay. But so take Britain out of it then. Bad example. But everywhere else, not looking good, including here in Israel, and potentially if Donald Trump wins in the US elections in November. So, I mean, the trend is kind of against you, no?
So I don't think so. I think one thing I would say, and you have enough experience in politics to know this is true, is even a good political idea doesn't win every single time. There is a pendulum in politics, and there comes a time when you're in power and when you're out of power. And the test of a good political movement is whether it's effective when it's in power and whether it's able to rebuild and adapt when it's in the opposition and then come back into power. So I would say, look, you can look at France and say, yes, is there a rise in the far right? Yes, there is. But you also have a centrist president who's won 2 elections in a row to the presidency. In the European Parliament, the balance of power hasn't actually really shifted that much across the whole of Europe. And I think there are plenty of other examples. But if we take the Israeli example, and I should say, I really started working on this book in earnest after the November elections, the last elections, when I woke up in the morning with a sense of dread about what a right-wing, mostly extreme and certainly populist government was going to look like and what it was going to do to Israel. And I think you and I spoke about it at the time as well. I was fearful about the kind of changes they would try to make. I'm sad to say that I think most of my predictions were pretty accurate. But even I didn't predict quite how terrible this government would be, quite how disastrous it would be for Israel. So I think there are actually a series of places where centrism is doing well. And if we look at the Israeli example, if there was an election held today, the next Israeli government would be a center-left, center-right government. Those are the parties that people go to. Now, are people more hawkish on security after October 7th? Of course they are. It makes sense. People are fearful after what happened. People are angry after what happened, and that all makes sense. But there are 2 things that the right has traditionally, I think, offered. And when they've shifted from kind of a moderate mainstream right to a far right, those things have fallen apart. One of those is the political right, the political center right, has always offered a sense of competence. Right? There was a level of good management. You were never going to get any major advances. Things weren't going to progress particularly quickly on issues that maybe some of us care about, but you knew you were going to get competence. And clearly what we had in Israel was a government that was utterly lacking in competence, and that's even before October 7th. And I think October 7th was in large part due to that government incompetence, but certainly October 8th, when you and I remember that the government disappeared, there was no government in Israel on October 8th. The people who stepped up was civil society. And that is because a government built on populism, built on short-term headlines, can't manage day-to-day politics with the complexity of the challenges that we face, let alone a major crisis like the one that we were in. So what you're seeing is, because of that lack of competence, because of the failure on security, and because I think the center in Israel has done a good job saying, hey, we're the patriots, right? We're the patriotic camp, and we love our country and we're passionate about it. And when we went out to protest the judicial reforms, we did it with an Israeli flag in our hands because we love the country, the country that we're from. What you're actually seeing is that the public is rallying behind that and moving back to the political center.
As you're saying this, I'm reminded I gave a talk a few days ago and to a group, and someone said, pulls out. You wrote in October 2022. I'm like, oh my God, where's this going? That's just like a few weeks before the November election that Ben Gvir has the potential to see like the demolishing of Israel's democracy and would be a stain on Israel. And he's like, do you still stand by that? And I said, hold on. I mean, like, have you seen what happened to Israel in the last, I guess, almost 2 years now? I mean, like, did I say something wrong? Sadly, like, this is what happened. But the thing that you and I have also spoken about is how when you're in the center, it's more complicated, because when you take up a position on the far right or the far left, and you let's go with the Ben Gvirs for an example. Reoccupy Gaza, resettle Gaza, kill as many as you want, right? Everything is black and white. There's no complexity. And let's say the same on the far left, the people who are like, just withdraw from everything. I don't care anymore, right? Being in the center means you really have to, you have to grapple at times. I've long felt. I mean, do you agree with that description?
Yeah, look, the extremes are always very clear. Their message is always crystal clear. That's why it fits well into a tweet. That's why they're good at coming up with slogans. I think as Netanyahu, by the way, has descended further and further into populism, he's become better and better at coming up with catchy slogans that don't mean anything. But the problem that with those extremes, and you see it on campus protests in the US calling for a ceasefire now, end everything now. Okay, that's a legitimate point of view, but there's some complexity there, right? Like, does that ceasefire include bringing back all the hostages? Does that ceasefire mean the end of Hamas in Gaza? Because those are parts of what a ceasefire means. Right. And if one side doesn't want a ceasefire, then you're just chanting slogans in the streets. And the same is true on the other side. Reoccupy Gaza, take control completely, wipe everybody out. That sounds great. We'd all like to get rid of every last Hamas snake in Gaza. The question is that a workable policy that's actually going to lead us to a better place or not? So yes, in the sense you have to grapple with complexity, but the world is complex. To ignore that complexity leads you to disaster. The challenge, I think, for centrists is how do we make a case that is compelling, that sounds as passionate, as committed as the extreme,
as clear also,
and as clear. And I think the answer to that comes from step out of the specific Israeli context to the wider conversation for a second. I would say if the extremes feed off fear and off division and off hatred, because they're the strongest motivating factor, then I think there are three things that centrists have to do, and I think these come up throughout the book in the various essays. The first one, and here I rely on Rabbi Sachs, on the late Rabbi Sachs, whose voice I have to say I miss dearly at times like this, because I think his moral clarity and thinking was some of the best we've had in our lifetimes. He talked about a politics of hope, and he talked about the difference between hope and optimism. Optimism is passive. Optimism is, I believe things will get better. Hope, and I don't know if there's a more deeply Israeli concept, it's in our national anthem. Hope says we can make the world better. We can change things for the better. And I think countering the politics of fear with the politics of hope, not out of some naive utopian vision that everything will be okay, but out of a sense that if we do the right things, we can make things better, I think is the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is centrists have to deliver, which is when you get the chance, and you will get the chance to govern, you have to do things that make people's lives better. They have to feel the results, because that is where we have a competitive advantage over the populists and the extremists who simply can't do that. Again, go back to Israel. Before October 7th, the economic situation in Israel was on the way down. Murder rates were up. Terrorism was up. It's not like October 7th was out of the blue. The situation had deteriorated in Israel over the course of this government's lifetime. And actually, if you look at the government before that, the Bennett-Lapid government, it was a far more effective government. Short-lived, but far more effective. That's the second thing. The third thing that centrists have to do, and I think this is a weakness, and it's one that we have to address. People who vote for extreme parties or for illiberal parties or for populist parties, and the definition changes, I think, wherever you are, aren't in and of themselves extremist or racist or anti-democratic. They are looking for somebody who genuinely understands the fears that they feel. And those fears are legitimate, right? They are real. when somebody is scared of technological change, right? The idea that they've worked in a factory all their life and there's no way that their son or their daughter is going to be able to work in the same place of work anymore because all they hear is that technology is going to wipe out their jobs. That is a legitimate fear that people have. When people fear that mass migration is going to change the national identity, that is a legitimate fear to have. Now, what centrists need to do better is say, we understand those fears. In an Israeli context, I would say it's a national security thing, right? To say, we get it. We understand why people are scared of those things. They're right to be fearful. They're right to be concerned. They're right to have grievances over the way that some of these things have been managed. And when we connect with that, we're the ones that can offer you better solutions. And I think if we can do those three things, we can make the clear and compelling answer that counters the message that the extremists come forward with.
You know, as you're saying this, I'm thinking of a few days ago, I was, I guess, doing some interview, and one of my middle children overheard me and said, you know, Abba, Dad, you're a leftist. So I said, okay, what did I do? Well, she said, I just heard you giving an interview and you were saying that not all of the Palestinians in Gaza are terrorists, right? They're not all Hamas. So I said, well, where did you hear the opposite? So she shows me how on Instagram, right? Everybody's saying, you know, Ein chaf mi pesha. There's no one innocent in Gaza, right? It's so, you know, so then you got to, to explain how not everyone is a terrorist, you actually have to explain. You have to say why, but yes, they've been incited and there's radicalization and you got to get into an explanation. Much more complicated than just saying everybody's a bad guy. Yair, I want to move with you for a moment. So, you know, it doesn't surprise me that you wrote specifically this book because of, A, I know you a bit, but B, who you work for, Yair Lapid, has long prided himself in being that centrist type of leader here in Israel. You mentioned Macron. I mean, Lapid and him are known to be good friends. So it doesn't surprise me that this is the book that you are ideologically, let's say, putting yourself behind. I want to ask you, though, when you look at the last 9 months of this war and how it's been managed, and you mentioned the prior government, the one that you guys were part of, and you worked in the foreign ministry, but also in the prime minister's office as an advisor to Lapid in both of those roles. Where do you see the biggest failure or flaw or mistake that this government has made in the last 9 months?
I think it's the original sin. It's the belief on October 7th that this war could be managed effectively with people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich still in the government. What Yair Lapid said on October 7th and what Benny Gantz didn't say on October 7th. Yair Lapid said, I want to join the government, even with all the criticism of Netanyahu, and I don't think you'll find many more vocal critics of Netanyahu. But I'll join the government because we understand the gravity of this moment. But to deal with the gravity of this moment, we have to create a government that is able and built right that can cope with this with this enormous crisis that we're now facing. And we all understood, I think, very quickly the scale of what was about to happen. The decision to create a government with Ben Gvir and Smotrich still in it, with the populism still dominant in it. If on October 8th, the government of Israel had been made up of Likud, Lieberman, Gantz, Gideon Sa'ar, Shas, and had been a government that was focused purely on the war, purely on what is the right thing for our national interest, we would be in a different place. Now, I think Netanyahu has a huge part in that. I think he's mismanaged huge sections of this war out of a political interest and made the wrong decisions on many places. But you say to me, what is the one biggest mistake? It starts there.
Because then I understand everything from there, the failure to articulate a day after plan is a result of that. It's a result of the political constraint.
It's the political strength, but it's also the message. The message of keeping them in government is the coalition of 64, the politics are more important than this national moment. And that is a fundamental flaw. And from that, you end up with the two security cabinets, which was a disaster from day one. It just couldn't work. And everything from there, I think, leads to some of the problems that we face. Now, not everything has been wrong with this war, right? First of all, the two primary goals, the return of the hostages and the removal of Hamas, are two goals that I think everybody can get behind. I think the army got back on its feet incredibly quickly and impressively after the disaster that was October 7th. I think we've seen unbelievable bravery and heroism from our soldiers and some of the incredible technological advantages that we have. And I think we've had moments when we can be really proud of the country. But when you look at the decision-making level, I think that's where the problems have really started.
But I want to push back on that for one moment, because Netanyahu would tell you, I can't trust these guys, right? I mean, if I had kicked out the right-wing elements of my coalition, right, being Smotrich and Ben Gvir, let's say, and gone into a government, emergency government with Lapid, Lieberman, Gideon Sa'ar, Benny Gantz, whoever it might be, I entrust within them my political survival. They would topple me the moment they have the chance. So can I trust that part of the Knesset? I mean, he would make a good argument in saying no.
He would, if the argument was politics. If your initial question is, what is better for my political survival, rather than what is better for the country, at a moment like this, that's where the problem lies. If the question he is asking is, what's better for me politically, rather than what's better for Israel, what's better for the people of the South and the people of the North, then that's part of the fundamental problem that we face.
Sadly, we know the answer to that question.
I have to say, I struggle to think of another leader in a parliamentary democracy who would not have resigned after October 7th. Take responsibility. Now, you can say, we need stability now, and so I'm going to lead this government, this emergency government, for a year, and then I'm stepping down, or then I'm going back to the public to see if they have faith in me or not. There are other ways to do it, but the desire to hold on to power above the desire to make the right decisions is where all of this starts from. And I hope that that's now starting to fall apart and that's starting to crumble, and we'll be able to move forward from there.
So are you optimistic? Because look, the polls are shifting, right? He's back up, Benny Gantz back down. You guys are still a little more below even, there's this whole idea of the Bennett, Lieberman, Gideon Sa'ar conglomerate, that somehow going to sweep in and be the Messiah that centrist left Israel is waiting for. On the other hand, there's a scenario that when and if elections are held, which I don't see them happening that soon, maybe in the beginning of 25, although I could be wrong, Netanyahu might not win, but he might be able to prevent you guys being the other side from establishing a coalition.
So first of all, I'll go back to the thing, am I optimistic? If optimism is a passive virtue, then no, I'm hopeful. And the reason I'm hopeful is because we're working to make it happen. We're not sitting down, watching it and hoping it happens. So yes, I think it is possible. I think it's possible to bring down this government and replace it with something better. I fundamentally believe, and again, maybe this comes from the centrist kind of instinct in me, but I fundamentally believe in people. And I believe that the Israeli public wants something different now. There is no poll that shows Netanyahu's coalition, his very narrow coalition, coming anywhere near 60 votes in the next Knesset, right? And so that means we'll have to have something different. That means there'll be something. Now, exactly what that will look like, I don't know. Elections are at a minimum 4 or 5 months away. So yes, we'll have to wait and see what the final results are. It's a rebalancing. I think that's normal. I know Gantz was very high in the polls at some point, and you and I spoke about it at the time as well, that would come back down to something more relevant. I think we're going to see a group of parties that are all around the same kind of numbers. And so I think that's where things are headed. Do I think Netanyahu will win the next election? No, I don't. And I think, by the way, again, and maybe this bit is a little naive, but I think there should be a moment when he just stops and thinks about the national interest and realizes that the national interest is him stepping down.
Well, Yair, it was great to have you on the show. And people who know me have listened or read what I've been writing for a long time. And I just want to read one thing from just a quick, the back of the book. Division in society, the spread of misinformation, the rise of extremism, centrism holds the answers. And I personally couldn't believe more in that one statement right there. So I want to thank you and applaud you on writing the book, The Center Must Hold, Why Centrism is the Answer to Extremism and Polarization. Good luck on the book tour, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
So Avi and Shmuel, it's great to have you with us. And Avi, I want to start with you. You wrote a piece just the other day in Haaretz that basically says, yet to come out in English, still just in Hebrew, that the center can't and I'm going to translate it roughly, can't whitewash or just blur the main fateful issue for the state of Israel and for the future of Israel. And you referred there to the conflict with the Palestinians. So explain to us, because we just heard from Yair Zivan, who's pushing very strongly a centrism approach, works with Yair Lapid. They are the centrist party, so-called, in Israel, but you don't buy into it.
Oh, look, centrism is a very enlightened ideology and approach to life. It makes a lot of sense. When you're very young, you could be ideologically highly extreme, but when you grow up, you understand life much more complex, and you have to compromise and you have to find the middle way. So all that is very sensible, smart. But in the special case of Israel, where the major issue that actually have its imprint on every aspect of our life is the Palestinian problem. And here, the center in Israel is more concerned to locate itself on the ideological spectrum in the middle between the two real ideological approach, the right and the left. So it has no real answer to the Palestinian question. The moment he answers the question, he stops to be center. Because if you reply to the question, are you for Greater Israel, or are you for the division of the land between us and the Palestinians, for whatever reasons, at that moment, when you answer yes or no, you're no longer centrist in the Israeli predicament.
So I hear that, because you're right that the moment you take a position on something, you're going to be called either a leftist or a rightist. It's amazing. I mean, just the other day, I told this story of how my one of my kids overheard me talking about something regarding Gaza and said, "Oh, Abba, you're a leftist," right? In other words, the moment something is not black and white, it becomes you're immediately either you're taking a position. The three of us all know that in Israel, there's no word that is more of a derogatory term today in Israeli society than to be called a smolani, a leftist. Although I think that, Avi, you probably would wear that name with honor. But Shmuel, I want to take to you for a moment. When we look at the map, though, of the mandates, of the seats, and the political kind of shakeup right now, it does seem to some extent, despite what Avi's saying, and I hear that school of thought, but that Israelis actually want maybe a center. They want something that is not just populist, not just taking a position that's hard line on one side.
Yes, I agree with you, and I disagree with Avi. I think that what Avi said about centrism is that centrism is bad because it doesn't take his own position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The centrists in Israel do have a position. They reject both the ideology or the messianic proposals of the left and the messianic proposals of the right. They disagree that a two-state solution is a viable answer to Israel's challenges. They disagree with the cookie ideas on the right, such as we should reestablish the settlements in the Gaza Strip. They want something in the middle, and Avi is right in the sense that this makes them less inclined to propose something that can be implemented tomorrow morning as an ultimate solution to the challenge. But it doesn't mean that they don't have an ideology. They have an ideology. Their ideology is that currently we don't have a solution that is good enough on both sides of the spectrum. They reject both radical ideas, and they say, well, all we can do right now is try to meddle along and maybe find ways to handle the situation in a somewhat better way without being tempted into something that will not give us a proper future.
If I can react, there is no standstill in our life and in our politics and international politics. And therefore, it's what I would term as a non-decision-making policy. You make a policy if you do not take a decision. Now, in the case of Israel and the Palestinian conflict, the idea of the center to manage the conflict and to wait is actually supporting the process of occupying the West Bank and eliminating the chance and the possibility in the future to divide the land, and by that to protect the Jewish and the democratic nature of Israel. And therefore, what you call ideology, I do not, but it doesn't matter. The approach of the center is very destructive from the point of view of Israel's future. And I think, especially after what we have witnessed in October 7th, the center must take a clear stand on the issue.
Well, one of the interesting phenomenon about October 7th is that in both camps, the conclusion following these events was, hey, look, we were proven right. So now people like Avi say, well, look at October 7th. You have to come to my side now because I was right all along. But on the other side, on the radical right, they say the same thing. Look, we were right all along. Now Avi must come to our side. The center will reject both propositions and will ultimately go back. And I agree, not making a decision is also a decision. That's the decision Israel had been making for the last almost 60 years. And let me remind you that some people warned us back in 1970 that the occupation of the West Bank is something that Israel cannot hold for much longer. It's unsustainable, they said. Well, it's been sustained for more than half a century. So maybe that's the best we can offer right now.
You know what's also amazing, if you guys think about it for a moment, is that when we talk about politics in Israel, we still always go back to that one issue, the one lightning rod, the Palestinian issue. In other words, centrism, you go to America, you talk about centrism. That could have anything to do with economics. It could have to do with, you know, the issue, even in abortion, you could say, well, I'm not totally against, but I'm not totally in favor. I find somewhere in the middle. I mean, like issues of in other countries, there are other issues. Here, we constantly go back to that one issue, and that is the conflict that has just been with us ever since we were established as a country. And maybe that's the reason why it just never goes away.
No, but on this one, I would like to make a small correction. If you go and look at the latest JPPI survey of Israeli society, the June survey of Israeli society, we have a very interesting finding in that survey that, you know, will take a minute of explanation. We ask people, what is the definitive issue that makes them self-define as right, center, or left? And for the first time in many years, we found a significant difference between right and center left in Israel. The right keeps defining itself by the Palestinian issue. This is the most important issue for them as they think about themselves, about right wing. But for the center left, this is no longer the issue. The defining issue now is what they call cultural difference between us and the other camp. So on the one hand, you're right, we always go back to the Palestinian issue, but right now we discovered something in the polls that may testify to a new development in Israeli society. The right keeps talking about the Palestinians, the center left is more concerned about cultural differences, by which it means the judicial reform, the religious affairs, and the role of ultra-Orthodox in Israeli politics, and other issues that define the social ingredients that make the right tick versus those that make the center left tick.
With that, it's actually interesting what you're saying, Shmuel, because maybe that also partially explains this explosion that we're seeing, definitely in the polls at least, of this new so-called right centrist party that, if led by Naftali Bennett and Avigdor Lieberman, Yossi Cohen, the former head of the Mossad, Gideon Sa'ar, this, I call it the conglomerate of Israel. Like, if all these people suddenly come together, they would get potentially 35 seats. They would become the biggest party in the Knesset. And
That's exactly it, because they offer right-wing policy on the Palestinians, but center-left sentiment on culture.
Mm-hmm. So, Avi, what do you think about the plausibility and the potential success for a party of that kind?
You mean that party of Bennett's?
The Bennett, Cohen, Lieberman, Sa'ar party.
I think that they have very substantive potential because they are addressing the rightist mood that got strengthened in Israel following October 7th. And at the same time, the yearn of many in the Israeli public to have much more sane and responsible and balanced representatives. So this is the message of that new potential party. Alas, they are not going to have any serious initiative regarding the most important dilemma of Israel, which is the Palestinian dilemma. We are, again, back to it. So to me, there is no much promise in such a party because we will all be waiting for somebody else to lead us to a political solution. And it's a big frustration for me because I think that Israel should initiate her way.
It's actually
Avi
interesting.
just forgot to add the last sentence that he always adds, and Carthage must be destroyed.
The interesting thing, and I want to get both of your opinion before we wrap up, just on Naftali Bennett specifically, but I did work with him for about 2.5 years when he was first in government as Minister of Economy and Minister of Diaspora Affairs. And I was with him on his first trip, and I often think back to the story. On his first trip to Washington, he was Minister of Economy. Then it was the Obama administration, and the Commerce Secretary, or Secretary of Commerce at the time, was a woman by the name of Penny Pritzker, whose name has recently come up. She's on the board of Harvard, around that whole thing. Penny Pritzker would not meet Naftali Bennett because, if you remember, back in the Netanyahu government that was established 2013, went till 2015, he was the most right-wing extreme element of that party. He was seen as the settler bad boy, so-called. And it's amazing how things have shifted in these 10 years that have passed since, of how now he's looked to as this, not only somebody unifying factor, but also I think that countries around the world are looking at him as like, this is the Messiah. This is the guy that can come back and bring Israel back on the track. Although they are, I think what they're missing is exactly what Avi was just saying, is they might not understand is that, yes, this is not Bibi, but it's not going to be the other thing. It's not going to be what they might want. So Shmuel, give me your quick analysis of where Naftali Bennett is going, and then we'll go to Avi.
I'll take a huge risk and say he's the most likely person to become Israel's next prime minister after the coming election. There is a very good chance that Naftali Bennett is the next prime minister. And look, Bennett, you worked with him. We've known him for some time. Bennett is a chameleon. He can wear new uniform as he becomes the prime minister. And I think that the international community and also Israelis are quite right to identify that the benefit of Bennett is not going to be a complete overhaul of Israel's, foreign affairs policies. It will be a tendency to form a more centrist government, to let the true radicals, to weaken the force of true radicals to impact the policies of Israel, and to try to find a realistic approach to what we can and what we can't do. I don't think that Naftali Bennett is likely to fulfill Avi's vision for the Middle East. I'm not sure he's going to fulfill my vision for the Middle East, but I think that he will be sober enough to try and understand what can be done under the current circumstances without having the pressure of the radicals making him do things that he does not want to do, or he does not think will benefit Israel in the long term. So a messiah he will not be, but a rescue from a truly radical government, the one that we have now, he can and hopefully will be.
Avi?
Well, even if Naftali Bennett is the next prime minister of Israel, he's not going to be there alone. He will have to establish a winning coalition, and he will be constrained from various reasons, not only by his own ideology. And therefore, I do not see a serious Israeli initiative on the Palestinian issue. I do see a potential, I'm not sure, a potential appearance of an outside initiative led by the US. It would be the next US president. We don't know who that guy is going to be. And the question is, to what extent the Bennett government will, quote unquote, surrender to the US pressure to follow its leadership on the political field, namely not only moving toward settlement with the Palestinian, but moving toward a different buildup of the Middle East.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And it'll be interesting, obviously, to see what happens. So thank you to Avi. Thank you to Shmuel. Thank you to Yair, who joined us earlier. And thank you to all our viewers and listeners. You can catch us for another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI on Thursday. Until then, have a good rest of your week.
Thank you.